What started corruption on the continent of Africa is what brought Africa to be. The African continent you know now wasn't a continent that was created by Africans, it was created for Africans with artificial borders, with violence, with deceit, subterfuge by the so-called colonial masters who sat one day, started by helping African leaders in those days, traditional kings, to help defeat their neighbors. That was how they started. That was after slavery. After slavery, they started by helping Africans to defeat themselves. And they didn't have colonies in those times, they had protectorates. So one day they decided that they were tired of having protectorates because at that point, they one of the worst mentally challenged kings in Europe, King Leopold, had set up a rubber plantation in Congo that's killed so many people. Stanley, who also had issues, had gone to the Congo. Brazza, who also most of this one thing is interesting about all the guys that claim they went and discovered Africa where people had mental issues. Either they were lost or they were looking for some form of escape from their own personal issues, including the guy who they claim discovered River Niger in Nigeria. That was his second trip. Mungo Park. Mungo Park was also a mentally challenged fellow who went there. Went the first time, couldn't make it. The interesting thing about it was that, and this is part of where the corruption of history comes from. Mungo Park never even made it past the rapids. So how can you discover a place that someone you met there was one who put you in the canoe? As it stands with Stanley. Stanley never discovered anything. The people of the Congo were the ones who took them and showed them all the villages that were along the river. So they were the ones who discovered the Nile, the white, and they were the ones who took all the colonial masters to where they found these things and then renamed and corrupted the continent with it, and then did whatever they did with us. So after the protectorates, they met in 1885 and decided with Leopold, who at that point, whose only job was running after a 13-year-old girl. And he went over to Germany and said, "Look, why are we helping to protect this Africa? Just let's partition Africa amongst ourselves." And that was how the partitioning of Africa came. And everybody, every hamlet in Europe was interested because you can't call them even countries in those days. Italy was a small place. The UK was pretty much about Liverpool and the business of bringing slaves and produce. Uh, Germany was run by these crazy people who later led to two wars. So, and they decided to partition Africa amongst themselves. And what is interesting about it is it started from corrupting the culture. They were the ones who introduced violence. They also were the ones who introduced corruption that we're talking about today. So, to the point that, without sounding as cliche, it's the most corrupt places in the world today are not even on the continent of Africa. The most corrupt street in the world is Wall Street in New York. So, but, and this is very important, that Africans don't get it wrong, that their own people too, because you're talking about decolonization. When the colonials left, they left some of the worst characters, mentally deranged thieves to run the continent because they cannot deal with real Africans who had the intellectual capacity to run Africa because they've seen Africa. That if real Africans lead Africa, Africa will beat all of them silly in a matter of, just like they're doing today in New York at the marathon. All the female leaders are Africans, all the male guys who blasted through the finish line are Africans. So how can you imagine that people who can run for 42 kilometers nonstop will be beaten by white people who are, some of them are just now just reaching the 15 mile of a 26-mile race in New York. I'm talking about physical energy now. And all this is important contextually to understand how we got here. It has to do with how they sustain the leadership that get Africa to where, especially after that whole struggle for independence. And if you look at Africa, as I've always said, Africa was not even named after Africans, they're named after roads. Rhodesia was a guy who was stealing gold. uh, Nigeria used to be slave coast with Togo and Benin because they were running around doing slave business. Ghana, so Gold Coast, there was Upper Volta named after a place they found a river they were using for business. And Sierra Leone was where they found, it was Sarah. So, and Cameroon was named after where they found the most amount of shrimps. So these guys just partitioned Africa based on what they could get. So they were the ones who brought greed uh, to Africa. They brought avarice to Africa. They brought violence to go with it, and deception, which they call religion, was how they rounded it all up, and then started writing the story of the defeated people of Africa in what we now call and they study as history. So there is nobody who will not win a Nobel Prize if the entire continent is forced to read their books. You know, you call literature, and Africans themselves can't even read their own languages, and we're still all over the place, including Twitter, trying to smack ourselves for not being able to write correct English or speak Queen English, and the Queen doesn't even know how to pronounce the Yoruba name. So I'm just putting all this together so that we can understand how the corruption started. Because corruption is not just financial corruption, there's cultural corruption, there's religious corruption, there's corruption of spirituality, and then you have geographical corruption, historical corruption. All of this corruption are the reason why we are where we are today, including even the economic policies that were introduced to Africa that popularized Africa. They were all corrupt. All of the loans that they're setting up, those loans don't exist in reality. You just package something and say, hey, you take these loans. In most cases, the loans don't even leave the bank accounts of the World Bank and IMF and their consultants. And then Africa will have to pay for things that they never tasted. And you imagine, for instance, the idea of gold, I mean, cocoa, and somebody's growing cocoa in Ghana, and a place that is frozen that cannot even grow cocoa farms becomes the place where you have to buy the most expensive chocolates. If that is not corruption, I don't know what is corruption. So it's a very oppressive kind of corruption. But we must also bring it back home, and I've mentioned it before. There is no way you're going to allow, those idiots that were imposed on the continent to also walk away because they love it when you exculpate them. Oh, you are not corrupt. It's the white man that is corrupt. Yes, those who are complicit in the direct stealing of our resources, who take the money meant for education, infrastructure, high-speed rails, and healthcare away and keep them in banks that they don't even know the passwords when they die or their families don't ever know about are also very complicit and they cannot be allowed to get away when we are defining corruption. So that is how I want people to look at it because, yes, I don't want us to become people who have made a career of blaming white people. Yes, I mean, white people have enough of blame. Everybody know who they are. We know how they operate. But how can you not know how to surpass the way they operate for over 60 years? You understand? Kids that were born, our own kids that are born like 10, 15 years ago know how to bypass their parents. How come Africans don't know how to bypass the white man when even some of the white man tools and research, I mean, inventions, quote and unquote, are there for us to use in getting past them. I mean, you have countries like Portugal coming back to borrow money from Namibia. That means there's something going wrong on their side, there's something going right on our side, even though they were responsible for the wars, strife, and crisis that had made sure that Africa doesn't go past where it is today. Even the map of Africa, I studied geography. It's unbelievable. Each time I'm flying and that rolling ball comes and Africa looks like a piece of stone and in the world when in fact Africa can still fit China, fit Northern America, and even South America. But when you are doing the map of Africa, it looks like, the it looks like just that's little thing that stands on top of a barrel of a gun. So I flew from France to Mauritius, and we haven't even reached South Africa yet for 12 hours. And it doesn't look that big on the map. You're gonna fly from Nigeria to Kenya, it's gonna take you some 4, 6 hours. It doesn't look that big. But if you look at the map of the US, where from the East Coast to the South, I mean to the West Coast, it's just about 4 hours maximum. It looks like the biggest place in the world. Yeah, so that is part of what needs to be corrected. But we cannot have that conversation without talking about our own share of the blame of where we are. And it's not only about these idiots that are being imposed on Africa to run Africa, but the rest of all us Africans who continue to accept this kind of useless leaders that were imposed upon us or continuously be imposed upon us from time to time. And we keep debating whether Africa is rising, or all those cliches that they hand over to us every year. And then the best representative of Africa are not even Africans. The one who define, what's the next logo Africa will look like, we use for their next international conference on hunger and starvation. We are not the one who are supposed to be subject of hunger and starvation when we have the largest lakes, streams in the world. We have the most amount of resources you can imagine. We could have the best species of animals and fishes, and untouched. And our biodiversity is unbelievable. And on top of that, some of the best weather you can find anywhere in the world. So what is wrong with us is why we cannot focus on our traducers alone. We must also have a very fundamental conversation about what are we doing wrong and how are we going to stop it.